Spanish National Research Institute in Madrid. I am currently researching in a European Research Council grant called ECHO. I invite you all to check it out on the ECHO website. You just need to Google ECHO CSIC, you'll find it. And with us is, we have two really big figures in the field of social sciences and health. We have Jennifer Dowd and Teresa Marteau. Jennifer Dowd is a professor of demography and population health at the Leverhulme Center in Oxford, and she is also a senior research fellow at Nuffield College in University of Oxford as well. She is currently the current director of Leverhulme, the deputy director of the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Research, and her research interests span a wide scope. She is a demographer and a population health scientist by trade, but she touches many aspects such as social epidemiology, biomarkers, infection and immunity, and she has published over 100 articles on those broad topics. She has been cited over 10,000 times, and I can tell you from my own experience, I am also a demographer by trade, that is very influential. And we also have Teresa Marteau. Teresa Marteau is a professor and director of the Behavior and Health Research Unit at the University of Cambridge. She is also the fellow and director of studies for psychological and behavioral sciences at Christ's College, Cambridge. Teresa is also extremely influential. Her research interests include development and evaluation of interventions to change behavior and improve population health, risk perception and communication in relation to behavior change, and acceptability to publics and policymakers of population-level interventions to change behavior. Teresa has published over 185 articles, and she has been cited over 45,000 times, which is amazing, and it gives you a good indication of how influential Teresa is. So in this session today, there's going to be a series of events. On the one hand, we're going to start off with these two speakers. They're going to talk a little bit about the social origins of health and disease. Jennifer Dowd is going to kick us off, and she's going to present, and then we're going to give way to Teresa. And after that, we're going to have a roundtable discussion. We're going to touch on several topics, and then we're going to open it up to the public for any kind of questions that you might have. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer.
Great, thank you. Let's try this. Gracias por invitarme. Today I'm going to talk very broadly about social aspects of health, and this is from my perspective. First, as a social scientist, I was trained in economics and demography, but then I became intrigued by the very strong association between social status and health outcomes. For example, when I found out that people with less education or income many times live many, many years less than people with higher income, it struck me as a very fundamental inequality. Because to have inequality in money is one thing, but to have unequal length and quality of one's life seemed fundamentally unfair to me and made me want to study this more. So what do I mean by biosocial determinants of health? In short, this refers to the fact that human biology really is a social biology. And we often think of health, I think, as a very medical, something inside the body. But what happens outside the body has really important fundamental impacts on health as well. And this is because humans are social creatures. We depend on one another for survival. And so, it should be no surprise that things like access to resources and the quality and quantity of our social relationships are key determinants of how long we live. So besides things that are very medical, like high blood pressure or high cholesterol, social isolation can also contribute to heart attacks. And we know that lower socioeconomic status can also increase susceptibility to viral infections, and stress can also promote cancer tumor growth. So I think I'm going to try to argue that there's a strong case that social connections and social status are some of the most important determinants of health. And I like this kind of idea that the body tells stories or the body remembers. And this has really come to the fore in some recent science of gene expression, or an area we call epigenetics. And these are really some of the biological mechanisms that can explain how the body remembers our social experiences. And for example, social isolation can increase gene expression of pro-inflammatory genes, so inflammation that causes ill health. Low socioeconomic status reduces expression of stress-related gene responses. And early childhood family adversity can predict levels of DNA methylation in genes associated with immune function. So the body really does remember, and the body tells stories. And I think in contrast to this, a lot of times medical science, and certainly the diet and fitness world, really focuses on health as an individual responsibility, that health is a choice. And so when I'm teaching social determinants of health to my students, I often start with this picture that strongly suggests this is the type of message we get in media, that health is a choice that you make based on your lifestyle. Okay. Good, no worries. And social scientists and social epidemiologists have tried to push back on this idea that health is a very individual responsibility by talking about social factors as fundamental causes of disease. And this was a seminal paper by Bruce Link and Joe Phelan. So I encourage you to read the whole paper if you're interested. But the basic idea is that no matter the health risk that we face, whether it's heat-related deaths from climate change or COVID or access to healthy food, high social status enables us to have access to resources and knowledge and power that can be used to help, protect our health and avoid disease. And I think we can all think of examples, for this. If you are well educated, you probably know people who are doctors that you can ask questions if you suddenly get a diagnosis or find out who the best doctors are. Certainly having family and friends who support healthy lifestyles, healthy eating, makes it easier for you to do so. And then there's things like living in safe neighborhoods or in houses that don't have, environmental toxins, safe jobs, and the ability to take very restful and relaxing vacations, which I will say Europeans are much better than Americans at doing. But all of these things are ways in which our social resources can be translated into better health. And this does indeed show up in lower death rates for people with better resources. And we refer to this, it's probably not the best word choice, but in a lot of the academic papers, we talk about a socioeconomic gradient in health. And this is meant to capture the idea that it's kind of like going up a ladder as far as your risk. That we know that wealthier and more educated people live longer and healthier lives. And this does not reflect just a threshold effect that very poor people are less healthy. I think we can all imagine why, extreme poverty is not good for your health. But this actually holds true that even high-income people generally have better health than people who are sort of in the middle of the income distribution. And then also the reasons for this relationship are, they might seem obvious, or you might have some hypotheses, and we can talk about that. But in testing what's going on, it has been really hard to explain these associations fully. And this type of association has, existed throughout time, and that's kind of the idea of a fundamental cause, is that, when a new threat to your health arises, such as the sinking of the Titanic, your social class will often structure and help shape your risk. And so we saw that, and if you saw the movie, then you know that the first class passengers got the first opportunity to get off the Titanic. But we also see this today we can look at many different metrics, but this is actually looking at income levels in Catalonia, and you can basically see that, I guess it might be hard to read, but on the axis is looking at life expectancy at age 18. So this is how many more years you will live after age 18. And if you can't read it, there's actually, almost a 10-year difference in life expectancy from the very low to the high income groups. So we're talking about 10 years of life expectancy. These are, to me, that's a really big effect, and something, that's very concerning, that someone should have their life cut short by that amount of time. And we also see these differences in health by geography, and so here it's also difficult to read, but the red reflects lower life expectancy, and green colors are better life expectancy. So you all probably know what this reflects better than I do. In the U.S., we also see north-south differences in health that are quite extreme. In England, it's a bit reversed, where the north does worse than the south. But this is not something about the temperature. Generally, it's something about the social and cultural determinants over time that have impacted health. So you probably want to know, how is it that money gets under the skin? And this is a phrase that we use to try to think about what are the biological pathways that might explain these inequalities in health. And there are many hypotheses and large areas of research on each one of these, but it could be that your physical environment is unhealthy, again, depending on your housing. If you're in a poor neighborhood, you might have more exposure to pollution. We saw how much housing and neighborhoods might affect infectious disease exposures during COVID. Something that Teresa will probably talk a lot about are health behaviors. And, we often think about things like smoking and healthy eating or physical activity as individual choices, but we know that our social networks, our relationships, and all sorts of things about our social environment kind of help shape those choices that people make. In the US, we don't have universal health insurance, so medical care is often mentioned as one pathway linking social status and health. But it's true that we see these gradients in health even in countries with universal access to health care. So that doesn't seem to explain all of these differences. And then another pathway that I've been particularly interested in is thinking about stress and the psychosocial environment, and specifically how the biology of stress might impact a lot of different health outcomes. And I've been specifically interested in the immune system and lots of different things over my research career, but I think that's one way in which we see social status getting under the skin. And I wanted to study this, which was a bit strange coming from social science in the first place, because I really did believe that, perhaps if we can explain biologically the ways in which the social environment impacts health, that this will be more compelling both to medical scientists as well as policymakers. And so this is a quote from Michael Marmot, who is a very well-known social epidemiologist in the UK, and this has been a bit of a motivation for me to think about these biological pathways. And so, as I said, stress is the pathway that I have focused most on. And again, I think, some people, when I've talked to my family about this research, they say, well, some people have high-stress jobs who have higher income. If you're trading stocks in the financial system, that could be very stressful. But I think if you think about the fundamental chronic stress of not being able to pay your bills, or being worried that if you lose your job, you have no savings and no safety net, that type of really long-term chronic stress that comes along with lower income is kind of what we're thinking about. And this also includes kind of traumatic life events that happen more often in people with less income and education, deaths in the family or trauma and abuse, and just living in an unsafe neighborhood and having to be more vigilant about crime around you. Social isolation is very hazardous to health, and we know that it activates these stress pathways, and COVID was a very sad example of a lot of people being isolated and it impacting their health. And there's some research on even the stress of daily hassles, like if your car breaks down and if you don't have savings to pay for that, that becomes a much bigger crisis than someone who has the same thing happen with more resources. And so this is another quote, that it's really, we can all rise to the occasion of stress in a crisis, but it's this day-to-day chronic turning on and off of our stress responses that is very unhealthy. And a lot of this literature has focused on stress biomarkers. So cortisol is a stress hormone that you might have heard of. And again, the problem is when this is chronically elevated. So, if you have an acute stressor that you're running away from a predator, that's when the stress response is really healthy and useful. But when we activate these stress responses all the time, from worrying about our finances or sitting in traffic, that's when these systems kind of wear out and give us chronic overexposure to cortisol, which is unhealthy for a whole array of biological systems. Okay, and sorry, I'll try to talk a little faster. I was talking slow for translation now. And I've been particularly interested then in how stress impacts the immune system. And again, this actually became really important during the COVID pandemic, and thinking about how the pandemic would play out across different social strata. And this is a paper not about COVID, but we did have some data where we looked at immunity, T-cell immunity, in a large sample of older people in the US, and found that lower education was associated with basically weaker, a more aged immune system, which does impact your ability to fight new infections, something like SARS-CoV-2. And as COVID came onto the scene, I think we all realized that at first it seemed like everyone was equally vulnerable. We had Boris Johnson and Donald Trump getting infected. But as things went along, I think it became clear that people with more resources, again, this was fundamental causes playing out in real time, could really shape your risk of infection. Obviously, your occupation, whether you could afford to work from home or whether you had to be on public transportation, things like this, your housing situation, lots of intergenerational households living together were at higher risk. And then just your existing health affect the severity of your COVID infection. So, whether you already had diabetes or other risk factors really affected you, and that we know is more common in people with lower socioeconomic status. So this is a map of COVID cases in this area in Barcelona. And this is only from the first month, from March to April of 2020. But again, you can see that there is a social pattern to these infections, that they didn't happen just randomly. And this was very common across all countries during the COVID pandemic. This just shows that there were also more infections for people with lower income in Barcelona during that time. And again, I'm sorry if these are too small. These are looking then across countries, how COVID impacted life expectancy. And the bottom line is that different countries had very different experiences with COVID, and I think the social determinants were quite important there. The US did particularly poorly. Spain, we know, was hit very badly in 2020, but actually did much better in 2021. And this just shows the difference in COVID mortality between Spain and the US. And you can see that, about the time that vaccines came out, Spain started to do a lot better than the US in COVID deaths. And A lot of that it's not because the vaccine didn't work as well in the US, it was that the vaccines became very political, and the take-up of vaccines in the US was much lower and divided on partisan lines, actually, which was very, very sad in the US, whereas there was very excellent take-up of the vaccine in Spain, and that translated into much lower death rate in 2021 and 22. But this is just also a map of the beginning of the vaccine rollout in Barcelona, and you can see that also the percentages of people, I think green is higher vaccine take-up, that even something like whether to take the vaccine is also socially patterned. I think I'm going to skip this. We might talk about deaths of despair in the discussion, but I just wanted to mention another social aspect of health, because the US is really struggling with falling life expectancy, and some of the reasons for this have been thought to be because of deaths of despair, which, as the name suggests, are thought to be because of psychological distress and really a hopelessness about economic and social opportunities. And this has led to very high degree of drug overdose in the US, as well as increases in suicide and alcohol-related deaths. You can see Spain is doing much better than the US for drug overdoses, but it was brought to my attention that Spain is starting to see some increase, that red line, in drug-related deaths over time. And so that might be something we can discuss about whether this idea of social despair is translating into these unhealthy behaviors in Spain as well. So just to summarize, I hope I was able to convince you that kind of a medical view of health is not the only one, that our social and economic environments really do shape our biology and our health every day, even from before we were born in our mother's womb, we are getting those social exposures. And so to really improve population health and mortality, we need to pay attention to all of these environmental influences that shape and constrain people's ability to maintain their health. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a great presentation. I'm a big fan of that bottom line that we're not islands. We are affected. Our own biology, our own health is affected by the social and the economic environments, not just from our current environment, but also all the way throughout the life course and even before we were born, right? It's a really important point. So now we're going to hand it over to Teresa. And, the clicker. And she's going to talk about similar issues, but from a behavioral perspective instead of a demographer perspective.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to Jen for laying out so clearly the complexity of what we're interested in. As Daniel's already said, I'm a behavioral scientist, and I'm interested in our behavior and what shapes it, particularly without our awareness. So in this context, I'm interested in the behaviors that undermine our health and what we collectively can do to improve them. Taking just 4 behaviors: smoking, physical inactivity, our current diets, and excess consumption of alcohol. If we could change all 4 of those so that we were right at the healthier end, we could prevent 4 out of 10 cancers and 75% of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. As Jen's already mentioned, there's a gap in how many years you can expect to live, depending on where you're born. And the current gap you talked about of 10 years. And there's an even larger gap of nearly 20 years in the number of years you can expect to live in good health. So if you're at the very poor end of the spectrum in our high-income countries, you can expect to live 10 years fewer and an additional 10 years in poorer health. And a lot of that comes from these behaviours which are socially patterned. So, I want to look at where we collectively have done better at changing behaviour at scale, and where we haven't done quite so well, and look at what the commonalities are between the story of success and failure, and what more we, as citizens, as well as governments, can do. So, smoking, usually we think about this as a success story. I'm not sure if you can see this. These are maps on the left-hand side, the world in 2000, and then 20 years later, the darker colours showing a higher proportion of people who were smoking. So over 20 years, the rates have come down. For those of you who want a figure, just follow the green line, and that will give you the proportion of people in the world who are smoking at these different times. So my eyesight is terrible and my memory is not so good, but it's about, I think, 33% in 2000, and you'll see that there's a big difference between men and women. And this is going a little bit beyond where we are now in 2023, but we're around 20% of the world population smoking. So it's come down. That's good. And for those of you, just to map this in terms of your own experience, on the left-hand side, it's looking at rates of smoking in Spain in 2000, where it was around 38%. And now, I think it's about 2020, it's about 28%. So a 10 percentage point reduction. It's good. So, what was effective? I should say that changing behaviour is incredibly difficult, and I think we can all find a story of how we have attempted to change something in ourselves and struggled. And there is no one intervention. But for smoking, we know that one of the most important interventions have been taxes, so to increase the price of tobacco so that it becomes less affordable. We also know that restricting advertising and marketing has been an important part of the mix. So has more recently restricting where people can smoke, and health warnings and the introduction of standardized packaging of tobacco. So those have been very important. But thinking about Spain and where we are globally, why aren't we at 0%? It's more than 70 years since the epidemiologists told us that this was a deadly substance. It's the most lethal legal product. It kills 1 in 2 people who use it as intended by the manufacturer. Imagine a kettle that had that death rate, or a car. I mean, it's extraordinary. So what more could happen? What more could our governments do? New Zealand was, until Monday, the country that had the most ambitious plan. So they were going to cut the number of places where you could purchase tobacco to make it more difficult. They were going to reduce the content of nicotine in cigarettes, so they were less attractive and less addictive. And the eye-catching thing they were going to do was to increase the age each year by which you could legally purchase tobacco, so that anybody born in 2009 would never be able to legally purchase cigarettes. We can come back to what's happened to that policy. The UK government is saying that they are planning to introduce that. So those are just giving you some ideas of what more governments could do to get us down to 0% for this lethal legal product. What can you do? Well, if you are a smoker, you may want to use some of the help that's available to encourage family and friends to stop, to encourage any education in your children's schools. And as a citizen, you might want to write to your local or national elected representatives to encourage them to do more. So I would say on tobacco smoking, it's a story of success, but we've got a way to go. So if we come to looking at the weight of the world, this, I think, is, most people would agree, a story of failure. So if we look just over 40 years, again, looking at these coloured maps, you can see a very different world in 1976 in terms of proportions of the world that were, this is just looking at obesity, compared to 2016. At the moment, 38% of the world's population is overweight or obese, and by 2035, it's predicted that it will be over 50%. So that's 4 billion people having excess, unhealthy weight. And that, you remember that at the beginning I talked about the conditions. Well, there are 13 cancers associated with, causally linked to obesity, and 75% of type 2 diabetes. So this threatens to bankrupt health systems globally. Okay, to zoom in on Europe, and sorry that this is an eyesight test that certainly I am failing, but if you bear with me, this is a report that WHO European region published in 2022, and WHO Europe has divided Europe into 57 countries or regions. So it goes beyond the EU. And I've marked what the average is, and it's around 58% of those of us living in these 57 countries or regions who are overweight or obese. Now, Spain, as you can see, is above the average at around 63%. So I don't want to shame you, because in the UK, we beat this race. And it's around 67%. And you'll see that there's a difference between men and women as well. We're not in a good situation in 2022. Our countries have had high-level plans and strategies since 1997, I think, when the UN and WHO talked about this as a coming epidemic. WHO has set goals for countries not to reduce obesity and overweight, but just to keep it stable. And no country has achieved that yet. So, what can we do, and what are our governments beginning to do? It's not unlike the interventions that I've mentioned for tobacco. It's about changing our physical and economic and social environments, because it's that triggers these behaviours. So, first of all, looking at affordability, we know that junk food is cheaper per calorie than healthier food. Now, many countries, and Spain is one of them, has increased VAT on sugary drinks, on colas. There are now over 100 countries in the world that have done that, so that's good. So that reduces the affordability of one part of our diet, but there's very little action to move that over to food. So we need to increase the affordability of healthier foods and decrease the affordability of the less healthy foods. Availability. Where you live, fast food outlets, this is just showing in the UK, but it's the same in Spain. The more deprived, the poorer the area, the more dense are the outlets for fast food. For any of us, whether you're rich or poor, you're more likely to consume, to buy fast food if it's close to where you live. So you've got a penalty for being poor there. Similarly, if we look at what's available in cafeterias or restaurants, this is just using one example, if we increase the proportion of the healthier food, in this case it's vegetarian meals, and reduce the proportion of the less healthy food, in this case it was meat-based meals, then you shift what people will select, and you don't reduce the number of people coming into your outlet. That's the content of food. Size. Stuff got bigger. And this is from the US, and you can see across the bottom, the people got bigger along with the stuff that were being sold. And I'm not showing you the data here, but based on a very large review where we brought together evidence from 69 studies, the bottom line is the larger the serving size, the more we eat and drink. And a particular English problem, or rather, we were able to look at the size of wine glasses in England over 300 years, with help from the Ashmolean in Oxford, giving us the glasses from the 18th century, and those got bigger. And we know that the larger the wine glass, the more people pour into it, and the more people drink. Finally, in terms of what it is in our food environments that cue us to consume foods and drink that are bad for us, advertising is really powerful. And this is taken from colleagues' study, where for 1 year they had the cooperation of Transport for London, and they removed all advertisements for junk food. And by comparing with Newcastle, they found that it reduced the amount of sugar that people living in the London area were buying by twice as much as the tax on sugary drinks. And in particular, it reduced how much chocolate and sweets people were buying. So that may be a particular UK effect. But the important thing is this was done at a local level. So it was the mayor who had control over this particular environment. So given our national governments tend to be quite slow to act, having regions being able to change food environments, I think, is going to be very important. So finally, I just want to talk about why it is our governments, and I mean globally, are very slow to implement the evidence on changing food environments. And it's the powerful commercial interests. If the evidence that Jen, myself, Daniel have been generating, paid for out of the public purse, were implemented, they would lose profits. So in a classic book, The Merchants of Doubt, doubt is what these corporations use, they cast doubt on our science and doubt on the scientists, and they take out ads to try to oppose effective interventions. So the first was in the UK, standardised packaging of tobacco. Another one was an attempt to increase price of alcohol, and another, the sugar-sweetened beverage tax. So governments need to act to mute the merchants of doubt. We don't know how to do that yet. We've been pretty effective in tobacco, but we need to act much more rapidly on that. So my final slide, just to say in terms of obesity and overweight, we've got some governments beginning to do some things, but far more needs to happen. What can you do as citizens? You can attempt to change your food environments at home. You can attempt to change the food environments where you work with others. And as before, you can try to engage your local and national elected leaders. Because what we need, we've seen this from controlling tobacco, we've made some progress, but goodness, we need to do a lot more and go much faster in order to deal with the poor health that affects everybody, but particularly the poorest. And you being here, one of the reasons I'm really pleased to be speaking today to a non-specialist audience is it needs citizens with interest and voice to push our elected representatives to do more, to implement the evidence. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for that marvelous presentation. So now we're going to start a section where we debate on topics. I don't know if I would call it debate. I don't think we're going to debate per se. We're just going to talk about specific topics. They're going to give their expert opinions on some of these topics. And I would like to kick us off with one remark. So one of the reasons why, as social scientists, we care so much about obesity, and this might not be known so much, is that it's because people who have obesity are much more likely to die of cardiovascular disease. They tend to have diabetes. They tend to have disabilities. They tend to have psychological or lower mental health. And the important thing about that is that there's a concept called comorbidity, and is that they tend to have those issues altogether, right? So that's why obesity is kind of one of these central aspects of these diseases, right? So Teresa, one of the things that I would like to ask you, and I'll have a follow-up for Jen later. One of the things I noticed from your presentation is if you look at this story of success from smoking, right? And you can see that over time, smoking prevalence has reduced, right, in 20 years. But then you look at the obesity prevalence in the same time period and has increased. Parallel to that, if you think about the policies that we've been implementing, right? And I'll use Spain as an illustration. In Spain, the policies for smoking have been more and more restrictive. We used to be able to smoke in public places. I mean, I remember my dad, I'm from Spain. My dad said that he smoked in classrooms, and he was a soccer player too, and he said during a break between the two halves, he would smoke as well, right? So it's changed a lot.
So
and
as a child,
as a child,
teacher?
as a child,
Smoking
as an adolescent, yeah, it was, but the policies, I think, have been very successful because they've been very restrictive, right? In obesity, if you look at the policies that have been implemented, they're all about promoting. It's all about eat healthy, do a lot of exercise. And my question to you is, do you think that those policies should look more like smoking policies, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So first of all, I would say we've been pretty effective with smoking, but still bear in mind, this is a deadly product that you can still buy, and we're still, 1 in 5 people in the world smoking it. But in order to have reduced the rates, yes, it's not enough to identify what needs to happen and encourage people. We need to regulate. And I'm very clear about this. So the work, for instance, on size that in my group that we've done. So recently we've done work in restaurants and bars, and we know that if you reduce the size of alcohol, non-alcoholic drinks and food, you can reduce the energy very effectively. But thinking about the experiments that we've done on glass size, all the only effect so far has been to increase the amount of alcohol people consume, because the owner, the manager said, how fantastic, we now know how to sell more wine. So what we have is an asymmetry of evidence. If you're in the commercial sector, sort of one study, or actually we've now got 6 studies, is enough to change. We're not irresponsible researchers, so we've engaged with local people who control the licenses for places selling alcohol, and with the Home Office. And we need far more evidence, because it's going to be contested in court by the industry. So the bar for the evidence needs to be very high, and you need to have a lot of political will to want to fight that in the courts. So recently the Scottish government took on and won against the alcohol industry for introducing minimum unit price. But that took years. So I think that's why I think we need louder demand from citizens when they see this evidence, and as you've just done, Daniel, see it so clearly, that the corporations say it's about freedom of choice, we don't want a nanny state, and that's not changing, and well, actually, it's making things worse.
Can I just chime in on that? Because I thought
jump in whenever you want.
It was a very interesting analogy to think about smoking, because smoking obviously is something we want people to not do at all. And so it struck me what a unique challenge obesity is, because everyone needs to eat food. Yeah. So the policy areas, it's much more complex than just trying to change the social norms and restrictions around smoking. So how do you think about, I guess, the complexity of that policy challenge?
It's huge, and if one goes back in time, it's not that people have changed. It's not that people's will has changed. What's changed are the food environments, and I'm not naive about this. There's a whole macroeconomy behind it. And we're talking about obesity. We need to think about food within the climate emergency as well, because about a third of emissions that we need to cut come from agriculture and the whole food system. So the challenge now is, how do we feed globally 10 billion people, because that's the projected number in the next 15 years or so. How do we feed 10 billion people a healthy diet that's produced within planetary boundaries? So I think it becomes even more complex to be able to do that. So we need to change the supply, what food we're growing, how we're growing it, and what food we're manufacturing and what's available. So I think we need to put obesity and the need for a planetary health diet, as it's called, together, and that will be stronger. It's a bigger challenge, but we can't look at obesity, I don't think, outside of the context of the climate emergency. Yeah.
If you think of it, it's kind of an investment in the future, if you will, right? Because on the one hand, you have the investment in the climate, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, these people who are currently experiencing child obesity, they're very likely to be obese down the line.
Absolutely.
It's going to be a cost for not just them, obviously, but for the state and the healthcare system. So it makes sense from an economic perspective as well.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you mentioned, I want to bring it to the concept of deaths of despair, Jen, that we kind of cut you off there. I'm sorry. I often think about, so both of you mentioned the social gradient, right, in diseases and health and so on. And when I think about deaths of despair, I think about fentanyl and I think about everything that's happening, and that's completely banned, right? I mean, right? But you still see an enormous impact. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so I guess for those of you, I touched on it a little bit, but the US probably for the past 20 years has seen a very dramatic increase in drug overdose deaths. And I guess, and most recently it does seem to be due to fentanyl because it's just so much more lethal in the drug supply. So possibly usage hasn't changed, but it's gotten more lethal. But in that case, it was really interesting because the US, this opioid epidemic started with actually commercial promotion of legal prescription painkillers. And I understand, there's some good books and documentaries about the family, the family and companies, the Sackler family that really promoted to doctors the use of these medications to treat pain. So there was a big campaign that pain was undertreated. So I think in the beginning there was a big supply push and big commercial aspect to this. And that's, I think, just almost been difficult to walk back then socially. But I think Angus Deaton and Ann Case, who coined the term deaths of despair, would argue that this kind of interacted with a social vulnerability in people who were having chronic pain because of their occupations, because of the obesity epidemic, but also facing the breakdown of marriage and family and economic opportunity and broader social things that led to this increase in substance abuse. But I think it's a narrative, it's a story that's been told, but whether that's the real driver, I think a lot of people point a lot more to this pharmaceutical push that was given to the drugs as the principal cause of the current epidemic. So I realize that context is different and every country didn't have the kind of legal promotion of opioids, but fentanyl seems to be reaching all countries bit by bit, sadly.
Yeah, and it seems by some of the graphs that you showed that it's starting to increase in Europe as well.
Yes, I think we are seeing some increases in drug deaths in Europe, but just so you know, the levels are so much lower than what's happening in the US. It's still not nearly the same scale.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I want to kind of bring to the table is the impact that these things can have, right? So in particular, deaths of despair, right before, up until I think it was 2015, life expectancy had been increasing steadily about a quarter of a year every year, right? And then all of a sudden in 2015, it started to go down or it stalled, right?
I think it went down for 3 consecutive years in the US.
Which for a demographer is something that is...
Yeah, it's unheard of.
It's unheard of. And then you have the COVID hit,
right,
which also...
Yes. No, so this is something I study more broadly is why is life expectancy declining in the US, and we're starting to see, unfortunately, some stalling in the UK as well. And the question is the US kind of on the leading edge of stalling improvements more broadly in Europe? And as Daniel said, we've been, as demographers, amazed at the progress in the last century. We've just seen life expectancy continue to go up and up and up, and we thought this is going to keep going forever. But I think we saw some warning signs before COVID. COVID really caused a huge drop in life expectancy for not just 1 year, for 2 to 3 years in many countries. So it was a big shock to mortality. And, we don't know if we're going to fully rebound from that. So it could be that we're entering this era where we don't see the constant improvements in mortality and life expectancy that we've seen for 100 or more years. And yeah, that makes me very nervous as someone who studies this data.
Do you think that the impact can be so big that future cohorts or even current cohorts might live in worse conditions than the prior cohorts at a health level?
No, I think that's exactly the question we're worried about. And of course, for life expectancy, you have to measure that after people have died. So we are doing some work looking at health in younger cohorts. So comparing the health of 40 and 50-year-olds today to 40 and 50-year-olds 20 or 30 years ago. And at least in the US, their health seems worse by measures such as obesity, diabetes, but even onset of disability, other chronic diseases. So, we are seeing kind of these warning signs that, yes, people are getting less healthy in younger generations, when it always in the past was the case that people seem to be getting healthier than their parents. So this is a very, very troubling pattern, and I think we believe that the obesity epidemic has a lot to do with this in many countries, but we're sort of trying to understand what other causes might be leading to this.
Right. So if we were to design policy, Teresa, this question is for you. So we were to design policy. One of the things that I keep on thinking about is what would be a real way of being precise with that policy? So again, the National Strategic Plan in Spain by reducing childhood obesity up until age 15, and then they want to reduce it to a certain level by 2030, right? So should we focus on schools? Should we focus on younger children, even children who haven't been in schools, or even focus on parents who haven't had kids yet? Because we know that there's a lot of in-womb elements going on. What policies do you think we should follow? Who should we target?
The genius of targeting children is that children live with adults. And if we look at public acceptability of government intervention, the vast majority of people think it's okay for government to intervene to help children. So if you target your obesity strategy, if you call it a childhood obesity strategy, it makes the alcohol industry happy because alcohol then doesn't feature. And I should say that for those adults who consume alcohol, it's between 5 and 10% of their energy intake. So we shouldn't think about them as separate. But anyway, we need to target whole populations. Children, preschool children don't shop on their own. So it's about the food environments where the adults who provide for them shop. So there have been any number of interventions targeting schools, and in the main, they're really disappointing because guess what? You can't. The school isn't an island. You just sort of come out of the school and then you're in what's being called the obesogenic environment. So it's not simple. And some cities are attempting to have slightly more intensive approaches. So the Netherlands has been one where there's been quite a push there, and London as well. But in the UK, for instance, we've had successive governments, many governments since 2018, but they've all kept the ambition to halve childhood obesity from 2018 by 2030. We're on track to double the rate. So it's coming back to what you were observing, Daniel. If you look at what we managed to do with tobacco, actually it's taken 70 years, we've got a UN framework convention on tobacco control. We don't have one on obesity. So it's absolutely radical stuff. Now, WHO published, I think it's called an accelerator plan in 2022 globally to try to bring certain leading countries together from different regions to select from, I think it's about 12 different policies, some of them that I've talked about. And I have to say it's incredibly disappointing because to do anything, I can't remember the number of countries there are now, maybe 16 or 20 that are in this sort of leader vanguard. I would have expected you'd need all of them to do everything and more. We're just not going to get anywhere. So until we've got a radical plan, tomorrow, COP28 starts, and we're in a not dissimilar situation where we've got the most wonderful records of how we're just heading for the disaster. So I'm not sure, I don't want to be nihilistic about it, but coming back to your question, a childhood obesity plan I think is really good because everybody gets behind that. Whether you have children or not, we want to see future generations being healthier and tackling that. So that's where I would start, and I would litter it with interventions for which there is regulation, and attempt to do it in a way whereby we can monitor in real time, and that which is beginning to have an effect, accelerate that, something that isn't, change direction. That's what I'd be doing.
Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in this obesity epidemic as well. I was just thinking your focus on childhood, I think, is really important because also looking at people over their life course, it's very unusual for someone who is already obese to revert to being non-obese. Yeah. So, starting with children and preventing the obesity, I think, is really important. But I wanted to ask, given, that no society, we have no example of a society yet that has successfully reversed this.
Yeah. Or stabilized, at a country level.
What are your thoughts about the new pharmaceutical solutions, the Ozempic drugs that are, I think we're just in the early days, but as a potential anti-obesity intervention at the population level? Have you thought about kind of where that might be going?
Yeah, so I think that does have a role for rather like nicotine replacement therapy for the people who are already smoking. So for the people who are already overweight or obese, who are living in high-income countries, there is a role. But if we think there are 4 billion people, and the reason, many reasons, but the main one is our food environments, we've got corporations who are making profits out of harming our health. So it strikes me that while there is a role for pharmaceuticals, it's troubling that some governments are talking more about the pharmaceuticals and are just sort of giving up on that which is driving this. So it strikes me we have to go and. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about, and it's something that you mentioned in your talk about how the bodies tell stories, right? And you were talking about the use of biomarkers and so on, and inflammation and so on. And you were talking about how can we bring the evidence up to vision, and what, as social scientists, how can we mix with biologists to make a stronger argument for these policies? It's a big question, I know, but choose whatever you want.
I guess I'll take a stab at that. I'm not sure I have the answer, but having used a lot of biological data as a social scientist, to me, one of the advantages is that we can measure health, before a disease happens, for example. If we're waiting for people to have a chronic disease or to die and be in our mortality statistics, that's a long way at the end of a long process. So I think measuring biological markers, we can see changes potentially over short periods of time that allow us to test policies and interventions, and also subclinical markers that predict future disease that are happening earlier that we might be able to prevent. And so I know a colleague who has a different ERC grant to actually use this in children to look at these biological markers of epigenetic aging to test randomized early childhood policy interventions, specifically for disadvantaged children, to see if this can prevent basically the biological damage that happens even very early in life from disadvantaged circumstances. So I think the question, if we have that evidence, will it convince policymakers and politicians is a difficult one, but I think it is on us to build that evidence base, and I think showing the biology can help.
So you're saying, one of the things that you're saying, just to be clear, is by looking at certain biomarkers, we can actually predict whether a person is going in a certain trajectory to have a disease like obesity or CVD or diabetes.
Exactly. We don't have to wait to observe that when a person is older and it's too late to help or intervene. We can look at these precursors or biomarkers that predict disease in the future. Exactly.
But if it's our environment that's driving this, we need to change the environment for everybody.
Everyone.
And it's very interesting. I'm not obviously a political scientist or a political sociologist, but to know at what point change happens. So biological data, sure. A lot of economists produce any number of figures in terms of the trillions that are lost to economies worldwide through, let's say, smoking or obesity. We know it makes people unhappy. It shortens lives. It does all these things. So at what point does change happen? So what we've got ideology in here, and it's an ideology, as I say, neoliberalism, free market economies, and we've got industries that are shaping that narrative because it suits them. We've got interests from, as I say, some of the commercial sector. We've also got politicians' interests as well. It's short-term cycles. This is such a long-term problem. There's a way in which it feels like it's too important to be left to electoral cycles. So one needs sort of cross-party agreement on it, so almost to take it out of the politics. So we've got the interests of the politicians, and the other factor is us, what is being sold to us. We don't find that unappealing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be buying it. So it's a brilliant sort of perfect storm. And so flipping it round, as I say, I think that we as citizens rather than consumers have to be part of the push and the solution. And I find it really interesting that for climate change, young people think about Fridays for the Future. We've got any number of social movements for climate change, and rightly so. But try and find social movements for improving health and reducing inequality. Actually, they're few and far between. There are a few, but you have to, they're not household names.
Yeah, it is true. I didn't think of that.
I can't think of one.
I was trying to think of any kind of political movements against obesity, and
Yeah.
I can't think of it. Yeah.
So there's a small one in the UK called Bite Back, which is young people who want to get junk food out of the food system for a healthier future. But that's very niche.
All right, so our time is up for the roundtable, and we're going to open up to the public now. There is a microphone that is running around over there, and yeah, we are going to take questions now.
Thank you so much for the nice presentations from both Dr. Bean and Dr. Marteau. I wonder if there's any data or you know about any plan to compare the healthcare professionals' population trends in obesity versus the general population in the last 20 years. I mean, the GPs, the general practitioners, in the last 20 years have decreased the incidence of obesity regards the general population, or there are no studies on that, because the example of the GP, the primary care, is extremely important in our society. If we go to the medical office and the doctor has obesity, how can he recommend to change your habits? This is my question, especially with GPs. Maybe also, I'm not talking about endocrinologists or surgeons or aesthetic medicine. I'm talking about GPs. Any study on UK or US or any part of the world, or its plan? Because I think could be interesting this information if it exists. Thank you so much.
So I'm aware that if a doctor or a nurse smokes or is overweight, they're less likely to talk to a patient about it. Doctors and nurses are about the same size as those in the general population for their social group. Doctors stopped smoking very early on and provided fantastic data on the impact of stopping smoking on reducing lung cancer. And doctors early on became great ambassadors. And I think at that stage, say in the 70s, a doctor advising a patient to stop smoking had a 5 percentage point reduction on smokers in the population. For obesity, there's good evidence that from a colleague, Paul Aviard in Oxford, that the conversation that's helpful is talking about weight, it's very brief conversation, and asking somebody if they would like referral to a commercial weight loss organization like Weight Watchers. Otherwise, just mentioning it doesn't have much impact. And I'm not sure whether they looked at the weight of the doctor or the nurse. I don't know, but I could find out for you. But if we had, rather like with smoking, GPs and nurses, if suddenly they became normal size. But I think that this shows how even for healthcare practitioners, it's, battling, going against the grain, against our environment. Yeah.
Another question over there? Yes.
Ho puc fer en català? Vale. Hola, jo tenia una pregunta, que és amb els estudis que dèieu de tabaquisme. M'espero. Amb els estudis que deies d'aquests que tens de tabaquisme, o sigui, tota la gent que en teoria ha deixat de fumar, no pot ser que sigui que estan ara fumant vàpers? O sigui, que hi ha un gran auge d'ús del vàper. Hi ha algun estudi amb això? O no sé, si s'ha mogut la gent que ja no fuma tabac a fumar vàper.
So, is this a question about? This is a question about whether vaping is a gateway drug to tobacco
Or maybe also if people are quitting
by vaping.
but moving
Yeah.
to vaping.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yes.
I guess I don't know that data very well. Certainly vaping is increasing, and there's controversy about the marketing to young people as well because of a concern that it leads to more, I don't know, whether it leads to actual smoking or other substances. But my understanding is this is a kind of a big debate, and different countries have different perspectives on whether vaping is useful for harm reduction versus a risk of encouraging these behaviors in young people.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So my understanding is the evidence is that amongst tobacco smokers, vaping can be an important way of coming off tobacco, which is lethal. The concern is children using vapes because often it's not regulated, so the amount of nicotine in them isn't regulated, and it has damage. Say nicotine in adolescent brains. I don't know that we know what the consequences of that exposure is. There are also adverse effects in children's lungs. Whether it leads on to tobacco, I'm not sure. When I last looked at that evidence, but it was about 5 years ago, it wasn't possible to see that. But generally, it's not a healthy thing for children to be doing. So it damages their health, and there's also a climate problem with the disposable vapes. So increasingly, countries are looking to legislate more carefully with vapes so that they can be available for tobacco smokers to use to come off that, and not available to children.
Any other questions? Yes, question over here.
Sí, gracias. A la doctora Jennifer quería comentarle respecto a la esperanza de vida. Sabemos que en España es de las más altas de Europa, por tanto del mundo, pero también tenemos un porcentaje altísimo de discapacitados y de dependientes. A mí me parece que hablar en términos de esperanza de vida sin contemplar la calidad de vida no tiene mucho sentido, porque a mí me parece que debe imperar, dijéramos, la calidad sobre la cantidad. Eso por un lado. Y yo prefiero menos años de vida con más calidad que más con menos calidad. Y a la doctora Teresa quería comentarle que, digamos, los cambios en relación al tabaquismo y a la obesidad, y en relación a las políticas públicas, es obvio que se necesita un cambio de mentalidad y todo esto, pero también es un problema de justicia social y de equidad de los recursos. Veíamos que la comida sana cuesta más dinero y entender la comida sana cuesta una educación también. Entonces yo pienso que no es solamente una cuestión de políticas públicas específicas sobre la obesidad, sino una cuestión de mejora social y de equidad social.
Great question. Sure, thank you for that. I will talk about the life expectancy piece first. And yes, you're right. Spain is performing very well in life expectancy compared to the rest of Europe and globally. So I would say well done. Over 80 years for both, and Spanish women living especially long, I think the longest in Europe. So, but I take your point that we don't care just about the length of life, that we also care about the quality of life. And I think historically these have moved together, that as we increase lifespan, we're also delaying the age at which we start to have disability. But I think you're right that we're starting to come, especially in countries like the US, that have had the obesity epidemic for much longer, for about 40 years in the US. We're starting to see generations getting disabled and living with many chronic health conditions. So even if they're living longer, they're living more years in an unhealthy state. And that is a very big concern. We don't want to just increase life expectancy without increasing health. And I know that it seems like Spain is trending in a bad direction for obesity, but I think the levels are still, much better than the US and UK. But it is good to prevent it from, continuing to increase. But it could be that the obesity epidemic takes a few decades to show up in life expectancy because, it's like smoking. It can take a long time for obesity to kill you. Well, I think I'll stop there, but I really do like the point that, if we can if we can make social investments, they will probably pay dividends in all of these health aspects without the policies being specific to health. And this is something in social science that we call health in all policies, was one name for this, that investments in education and equality and economic equality will probably help all of these health outcomes that we're concerned about.
Yeah, I think your point is very well made, that there is a growing gap in the number of years between the rich and the poor in terms of how many years they live in good health. And I don't know if you have the debate in Spain. We don't have enough of the debate in the UK about if you pay more taxes, then you can have more provision by the state. And if we look at some of the Nordic countries, we can see less inequality and some better provision of social care. So again, I think that this is, it's very difficult, but it's something for us to be having public debates about. At the moment in the UK, everybody can point to problems in education, in the health service, in the health of the population. And the political discourse is about cutting taxes. So that's really difficult. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes?
Hi, I have two questions. So first one is, because I work with biostatisticians, and they always say correlation is not causation. So what I wanted to ask is, when we look at these graphs of people with less income, with poorer health, shorter life expectancy, to what extent could you share your thoughts on, how does these two dynamics play out? Is it a direct causation, or they could be, it could be a dynamic between these two factors, or it could be a reverse causation? Could you share your thoughts on this? And the second is, let's say, indeed, it is the less income leading to poor health, then do we see this effect being less in the states where free health is provided? Like in the UK, NHS is free. Do we see less of a correlation?
Sure. Those are big questions that are the topics of many PhD dissertations. So well done if you're trying to think of a topic. But no, it's a great question, and this was very oversimplified. we do believe, obviously, poor health, can lead to lower income, which is reverse causality, as we were saying. And we also think that there can be some common causes of low income and, poor health that, might have to do with someone's propensity to delay gratification and not want to smoke, and also stay in school longer. That some of those things could mean that income is not causally affecting health. And it's very hard because we can't do experiments on human populations to tease this out. But I think when you see how, early in life, a lot of these social gradients emerge that, based on the family that you grew up in, affects your health and other trajectories. I think that's where I see the more direct causation, that your sort of early childhood environment, which you didn't choose, has a big impact on where you end up health-wise. So I think it's always going to be a mix of all of those mechanisms, but I think it's very clear, you can't kind of look at the social patterning that persists over time and space and think that, it's all reverse causality or just correlation. So I'm always skeptical, always looking for good research designs that can help us understand it better, but I think a significant portion, especially of early life circumstances, is definitely causally impacting your health. And sorry, what was your second question?
In the States.
In the States. See, that's really interesting because to my knowledge, there's not a lot of evidence that the social gradient in health is smaller in the UK, in countries with universal access at point of service. I think the bigger impact is seen for the broader social policies, like in the Nordic countries that kind of support, have social and economic support across the board. Those social gradients in health seem to be less, and I think that speaks to the fact that health develops way before you go to the doctor, that the inputs into health and disease happen in your everyday environment, your food environment, everything. And it's by the time you're getting to the doctor and getting treatment, that's not really where these gradients are emerging. It can, play a role in making them bigger, but that's not the real source of the inequalities in health.
Could I just add to that? That I absolutely agree, and I share your desire to tease out the causal nature of these associations. So people have looked at so-called natural experiments where, by chance, a family that has a low income, it suddenly increased. So that's happened in some places where land of some Native Americans has been bought up for casinos, and so they got a lump sum of money. Sometimes welfare payments suddenly go up, and so from those studies it's been possible to look at what's the impact on children, particularly young children, on their brain development as mediated through the stress pathways that Jen was talking about, and also parents having more money to spend. And one of the interesting findings from this is that very often there's an argument that says, don't give poor people money, they're feckless, and they'll just spend it on drugs and alcohol, and no good will come of it, and tobacco. And actually, the data are really interesting. So I think there have been 18 studies that have looked at this, a World Bank study. And what they find is that if you increase the incomes of the poorest households, it reduces spend on alcohol and tobacco. So these are really important data so I'm talking about the behavioural pathway, but also there are some interesting cognitive effects on particularly small children. And in answer to the question, so one finding, say this is real bias, that particularly struck me, which was looking at likelihood of death in the poorest quartile in the US population. And the predictors were not having health insurance. it was obesity and tobacco use and physical inactivity. So that's not a reason not to have universal health coverage at all. But what it's saying is that actually it's the material, social, cultural context in which people are living, and we can take the behaviours as really kind of a signal. I mean, they go with being poor. And there's a way in which if you take people out of poverty, you've changed something biologically, psychologically, and socially, and their behaviours can begin to change.
That was a perfect.
That was yeah.